Here's what we're talking about, Austrian response to recent critics. And if you take nothing else away from this lecture, I want you to get the commercial for my blog. This isn't pure self-promotion. It's not that I'm saying you ought to go read the blog. It's just that I'm stunned that so many of you don't know I have a blog. And so that's the only reason for me bringing it up. You know, sample it. If you don't like it, that's fine. I'm not going to be offended, but you should at least know it's there for you. And it is free. All right, so I am talking about... Here, I'll read this in a second if you can't see it, don't worry. Lately, I would say within the last, 2 years, more and more mainstream economists have felt the need to knock down the Austrian business cycle theory. So that's actually a sign of progress, because before, they would just ignore it. But now so many business people are getting into Austrian business cycle theory, people in the financial sector and whatever. And so the old guard, the people who are the mainstream academics, they feel the need to tell everyone why it's so stupid. So that's actually, again, you might think that we should be annoyed by that, but it's great that this is happening, because it's showing that these guys are, sitting around. I don't know if they send out memos to each other or if it's coordinated, but clearly they're realizing we can't just ignore this. We have to address this idiotic theory from these guys with funny German-sounding names. So what I'm going to do in this lecture is just go over some of the main points that Paul Krugman and others have brought up recently to just clarify, because they keep recycling the same 3 or 4 points, and so it's good to know what the Austrian response is on these particular issues. So this is Krugman. I think this was taken from a Slate piece that he wrote a while ago, but then he came back to it. Actually, let me blow up the projection so you guys can see it better. Oh, okay, there we go. All right, so he says, here's the problem. As a matter of simple arithmetic, total spending in the economy is necessarily equal to total income, because every sale is also a purchase. So if people decide to spend less on investment goods, doesn't that mean that they must be deciding to spend more on consumption goods, implying that an investment slump should always be accompanied by a corresponding consumption boom? And if so, why should there be a rise in unemployment? All right. Now I'm just going to read a few things, because Krugman and Tyler Cowen had similar critiques. So I'll read, and then we'll make sure you get what their confusion is or what their problem is, and then we'll try to explain what the Austrian response would be. All right. And so then Tyler Cowen, who is an economist at George Mason, and actually has a book on Austrian business cycle theory. He's a critic of Austrian business cycle theory, but he knows the theory. He's read a lot of the literature, so he's not just some guy out of left field criticizing him. So he favorably quoted Krugman and then said on his own blog, Marginal Revolution, but I think the point is more effective in reverse. Why should the boom be a boom in the first place? The shift toward investment goods, and thus away from consumption goods production, should mean falling real wages, not rising real wages. In other words, the Austrian theory doesn't generate the very high degree of co-movement found in the data. Okay, I have another quote to give you, but let me just make sure you're getting his jargon here. So what Cowen is saying is, empirically, what you see during the boom period, it's not that consumption goes up and investment goes down, or that investment goes up and consumption goes down. They both go up together. That during the housing boom, for example, obviously investment, according to certain metrics, was way up. But at the same time, people are buying plasma screen TVs and fancy cars and going out to dinner and taking cruises. So it's not that the average American's standard of living in terms of consumption went down. And so Cowen is saying, what a theory needs to explain what a business cycle theory needs to explain is why consumption and investment go up together during a boom and then both go down together during the slump. Because right now in the slump phase, investment is certainly down, but so is consumption. All right, so that's what he means by the co-movement in the data. All right, and then similar exchange. John Cochrane had said a sort of Austrian-esque analysis. He was talking to some group, and he was trying to explain to them why the government should just sort of let this thing play itself out. And he said to this group, we should have a recession. People who spend their lives pounding nails in Nevada need something else to do. All right, so Cochrane, in my opinion, I don't believe he was espousing the Austrian business cycle theory by name, but his point was, he was grasping the essentials of it, saying that no, there was too much resources, too many resources and labor in the housing sector that needs to flow out into other sectors. It needs to be reallocated. And so you need to have a recession for that to happen. It's unsustainable to have so many resources in housing and other areas like that were bloated during the boom. So that was Cochrane's point. Again, you can see it's very Austrian-esque. And Krugman says, I'll move that up because I know in the back it's hard to see. So Krugman quotes Cochrane and then says, the basic idea is that a recession or even a depression is somehow a necessary thing, part of the process of adapting the structure of production. We have to get those people who are pounding nails in Nevada and other places and occupations, which is why unemployment has to be high in the housing bubble states for a while. So here Krugman's just telling his readers, this is what this guy Cochrane thinks. And then now, we'll get this in a minute. So why does Krugman have a problem with that? He says, the trouble with this theory, as I have pointed out way back when, and then he linked to that earlier Slate thing that I've already quoted from, is twofold. First, it doesn't explain why there isn't mass unemployment when bubbles are growing as well as shrinking. Why didn't we need high unemployment elsewhere to get those people into the nail-pounding in Nevada business? Okay, so I'm going to stop here, and then we'll come back to Krugman's second objection, because Cowan and Krugman now, we've seen several examples of what their problem is. Okay, so remember, I'll back up, make sure I'm not losing anybody. So the standard Austrian story is that Garrison went over with you. What happens? The central bank action causes interest rates to fall below their market clearing level, the correct rate that sort of balances people's time preferences with business people's investment projects, so that resources are being allocated properly between sort of present projects and future-oriented projects. So when the government intervention causes the banks to charge a lower rate of interest because they inflate the credit supply, that sets up an unsustainable boom, and it causes malinvestment. So too many resources are flowing into long-term projects. People start building factories, or in the factories they start cranking out components for machines that really aren't going to be useful to consumers until years in the future. So that's the idea. I don't know if Garrison used this metaphor. Let me say it just in case you don't want to leave this week without hearing this metaphor. Mises has a great example of a master builder. So somebody who's building a house, and he's drawn up the blueprints, and he takes an inventory. He says, how much lumber do I have? How much glass? How many workers do I have? Skilled carpenters and so forth. And then another thing is, how many bricks do I have? And so he counts up how many bricks he thinks he has. He draws up the blueprints thinking he has all these materials at his disposal, and then he gets the people to work. They start taking bricks, they start taking lumber, and start laying the foundation, and they start building the house. So now Mises' point is, suppose in fact there are fewer bricks available than the builder thought when he was designing the house. You can see that's a problem. That this house, the blueprints as designed, are physically impossible to achieve. It's just, so he's starting an unsustainable project. That's the idea. And in terms of the Austrian take on the relative virtue of the boom period versus the bust period, it's the flip of what most people think. So most people think the boom times are good. That's prosperity. And the Fed needs to just keep the boom going. I mean, they might not call it a boom. They might call it healthy growth or something. But clearly people think when unemployment is low and wages are rising and business is booming, that's a good thing, and then the bust is bad. And so the Fed's job and the government's job when the bust happens is to say, how do we turn this thing around and go back to the period of prosperity? Whereas the Austrians, it's the opposite. They say, no, when you're thinking about the boom-bust cycle, the bad part, the part where stuff is getting screwed up that we should object to as economists, is the boom phase, because that's where people are acting on the basis of false information. And the bust is painful, that's true, but that's when reality sets in. What happens in a bust is that resources are getting reallocated. Entrepreneurs are realizing, oh my gosh, I was in the midst of an unsustainable project, and so they react to the bad information. So yeah, it's not nice to learn you've been making a mistake, but it's better to learn it sooner than later. So going back to that analogy of the guy building a house, So he's building the house. Now the question is, suppose the workers, maybe the reason, I'm elaborating here, Mises didn't get this specific into the story, but suppose the workers who were in charge of counting the bricks, maybe that's where the error crept in, right? Maybe one of the subordinates had the job of counting the bricks and reporting to the architect as he's drawing the plans. Oh, we've got 17,000 bricks. He says, okay. And he designs a house thinking there's 17,000 bricks. And then the grunt workers realize, oh, we screwed up. There's actually only 15,000 bricks. So now the question is, when should they tell the architect that information? And the Austrians are going to say the sooner he finds out, the better, because the sooner he realizes, whoa, this plan's unsustainable, he can adapt. He can, if they had just laid the foundation, maybe there'll be no harm. Maybe he could say, oh, well, I'll just change the plans and I would have built the same type of foundation even if we only had 15,000 bricks, that's fine. But if he's already, finished the first floor and now is starting the second floor and putting the gazebo in the back and so forth, and then finds out he's got 2,000 fewer bricks, he might be in a panic because maybe now he realizes, I don't even know if I'm going to be able to put a roof on this thing, right? You see what I'm saying? So the earlier he finds out, the better. And you can imagine, just to carry the analogy just one step further to see how silly the mainstream prescriptions are from the Austrian viewpoint. Can you imagine if the workers, who realize the mistake, say, oh, well, we got to go tell him, and one of them grabs the guy. He says, no. Look at how happy everyone is at work. Everyone feels productive working on this house, the esprit de corps. If you go and tell him that we don't have enough bricks, what's he going to do? He's going to pull the bullhorn and say, everyone stop working immediately. Drop all your tools, because people are taking the bricks. He's going to go up to them and say, whoa, stop. And they're going to say, why? He said, because I need to redo the plans. I don't know what you're supposed to do with those bricks right now because the plan you're operating on is wrong, right? And then all those poor guys who were laying the bricks and having such a good time, they were whistling and having a good time, they're going to be unemployed. They're going to be sitting over on the sidelines while the guy has to redo the plans. And that would just bum everybody out. We don't want to ruin the guy's day. Let's not do that. We'll just hope it works out, right? You can see how that would be crazy. And especially, if they said, well, let's just print up more green pieces of paper and that will fix the problem. That we don't have enough bricks. That'll get us through the crisis, right? So you understand that what's going on there. That's the metaphor in terms of the economy as a whole. That yes, it's going to be painful. People who are in sectors that are bloated because of the false signal provided by the low interest rate, they're going to get laid off, but they should be laid off. It's not doing the economy any favors by perpetuating this malinvestment. All right, so that's the idea. So in response to that, what Krugman and Cowan's point is actually a little bit different, but it's similar. What they're saying is that doesn't make any sense. Okay, if what the Austrians are saying is during the bust phase, the reason unemployment goes up is that workers who are in housing and then in the financial markets, all these quants and the hedge funds blow up, and all these guys with PhDs in physics have to find something else to do, and all these guys in Nevada, building houses, they have to find something else to do, and that's why unemployment goes up because of the need to move labor around. They say, well, then how come that didn't happen in the boom phase? In the boom, according to you Austrians, all of this labor got sucked into the housing sector and the financial sector and so on. And yet I don't remember there being really high unemployment to get those workers out of whatever they were doing before and into the false sectors. So, you guys are being inconsistent. You're citing high unemployment because of the need to move labor around, but only when it is convenient for your theory. All right, so it actually, I don't want to belittle them, but that, to me, it's so obvious how you reconcile that for a while, I didn't understand what the problem was. So let me just say it again. The solution is that during a boom phase, when workers leave certain sectors to go into the expanding, unsustainable sector, it's not because they got laid off. It's because they're leaving, they're quitting voluntarily to go take a better job, right? So that's why unemployment doesn't go up. Whereas is that funny? So in the bust phase, what happens is people are laid off, and then they have to go find an inferior job, a job that they didn't want compared to the good job they had during the boom. So it takes time, and that's why a reservoir of unemployed people builds up, and it takes a while for them to get reallocated. All right, so just thinking through this, you got an original equilibrium, let's say. I'm going to simplify a little bit, but I just want to make sure you understand the logic here. And then say the Fed comes along and just starts handing out $100 bills to home builders and to hedge funds, and they start putting out want ads saying, hey, we'll pay for people to come work for us, we're hiring, and they don't get enough applicants, and so they start boosting their wage offers because Bernanke's just literally giving them $100 bills he's printing up in his basement, right? Why would that lead to unemployment in the short term? How could that possibly lead to unemployment? No, that would reduce unemployment. If everyone else still has the same amount of money and they're still doing their transactions, and the only change now is $100 bills are flowing in the pockets of a few employers in the economy who are now trying to bid away workers out from other occupations, right? Of course that's not going to lead to a rise in unemployment. That's going to reduce unemployment because some unemployed people are going to take those jobs, and then other people with jobs are going to quit, move over, and then other unemployed people might get sucked into those areas where the other people quit from. All right, so clearly that's going to reduce unemployment in the short term. Now, in the long term, that's not a permanent solution to the unemployment problem because, again, printing up green pieces of paper doesn't make us wealthier. It doesn't actually allow the economy to satisfy the preferences of the consumers. But in the short term, it does lead to a rise in employment opportunities. All right, so that's why you wouldn't expect unemployment to rise during the boom phase, is because of the difference between people leaving to take what seem to be better paying jobs. It's actually an illusion because those high wages aren't going to last when they get laid off. In other words, people might not quit their stable job to go work for the hedge fund that actually is going to blow up in 18 months, but it certainly appears at the time that it's a better job, and that's why they quit and go take it. Right? So that's the solution to that apparent mystery. The other thing is, as far as the co-movement in the data that Cowan was referring to, well, first of all, that's not an objection just against the Austrian theory. So he seems to be saying, look, there's trade-offs. If you're going to have consumption go up, then investment has to go down. And the Austrian theory then thus can't explain the co-movement in the data. But I could say that about any business cycle theory, right? If you were just taking as a stipulated fact that they move together, and the way we knock that out is by citing the production possibilities frontier, well then, any business cycle theory, you could just say the same thing, right? So specifically what happens, according to the Austrian theory, is that there's capital consumption. So that's how it's possible during the boom phase, at least in terms of using Keynesian macro aggregates, it looks like investment's going up and it looks like consumption's going up because consumption really is going up. But what's happening is people are eating the seed corn, if you will. So let me just give you an analogy I used for my business cycle class to get this idea across. So imagine if you've got a guy who runs a trucking company. So he owns 100 18-wheelers, right? So his business is he has clients who need stuff shipped from city A to city B, and he just looks and sees where his trucks are at any given time. So, okay, yeah, I can pick up that load, and then have my driver take it to the other city and drop it off where you need it, and I charge you the freight charges. Okay, great. So that's his business. Now, at any given time, he actually doesn't have 100 trucks out on the highway because there needs to be regular maintenance performed on these things to keep them in operating conditions. So let's just say on any given day, he actually has 5 of his vehicles in the shop, getting the brakes checked, getting the tires rotated, and whatever else you need to do to keep your 18-wheeler in prime operating condition. Right? So at any given time, normally he's got 95 trucks on the highway delivering stuff for his clients. And so he gets his normal income that way, and he runs his business knowing I actually only have 95 trucks earning revenue at any given time. Now, suppose a customer calls him up and says, oh my gosh, I own a chain of grocery stores, and the tomatoes that we got shipped in were all spoiled. People are going to flip out if we don't have tomatoes by tomorrow, so I have this rush order. Price is no object, but I need you to pick up tomatoes from this city and get them to my grocery stores by tomorrow, or I'm finished. So the guy who owns the trucking business can look at his papers and say, well, these 95 trucks are already spoken for, but what I can do is the 5 that were headed towards the shop, I can redirect them, and they can postpone their maintenance, and they'll go get loaded up at the wherever the produce thing is and deliver the tomatoes. And so actually in that period, he's got 100 trucks out earning revenue, and in fact, he's earning bonus money on those 5 because the customer has to pay extra, for the rush order. So someone looking at those books might think that, oh wow, this is phenomenal. Look at what you do with revenues. Let's just keep this going. right? But you can see how, no, that would be unsustainable. If he just kept taking new orders and not scaling back so that he could get those 5 trucks back in the rotation to get their tires rotated, at some point, trucks are going to break down on the highway. And then he's going to lose the load that's in the thing if it's perishable, and then he's going to have to spend a lot more sending out a tow truck and whatever to service that thing than if he had just done the regular maintenance. So in a sense, you could say, yeah, that guy, his revenues would be going up, and he would be taking in a lot more in receipts from his customers than he had to pay out in terms of gasoline and paying wages to the guys driving the truck and so forth, and paying tolls and whatever else his immediate expenses are. But if he's not paying to do the maintenance, you can see in a sense he's actually consuming the capital of his trucks, and he's not plowing enough back into the business. And so even though he's earning a bunch of money, he could be going and buying his wife mink coats and pearls and so forth because, hey, honey, we're doing great. I'm earning more money in these few weeks than I've ever earned in a similar period since I started this business. That would be very foolish on his part. Okay, so that's the analogy for what happens during an unsustainable boom with the economy as a whole, that business people feel wealthier than they really are. They're engaging in projects, and the reason investment seems to be going up is because certain physical things are happening. They're cranking out more orders of television sets, they're building more factories and so on. But if they knew on paper what was going to happen to asset values down the road, and they were taking that into account, actually their total wealth would be going down. So the net investment would be negative in a sense, from an accounting point of view. But they don't realize that. They don't see that this huge recession is coming and that they're going to have to shut down. So in their mind, in the short run, everything's great, business is booming, and they don't realize that the rug's going to fall out from us a year from now. And so that's why the capital value of their business as a going operation, they're not really dinging it from what they're doing right now. Okay, so that's the idea. Now, with the trucking company, it's obvious. With the economy as a whole, with each person just being one little component of the overall structure of production, nobody's the central planner who can step back and see the whole world economy and understand, the way the world was operating from 2002 to 2005, that was unsustainable, that was going to come to a screeching halt. No individual could see that because it was too complicated. But that's the idea. It was analogous to the guy running his 18-wheelers without getting maintenance done. All right, so why don't we move on then to Krugman's second objection. Incidentally, I have, for those of you who took my class yesterday, I set my alarm on my clocks here, so I will stop and give you about 15 minutes for Q&A at the end. Okay, so remember, Krugman said, my first problem is with this issue of investment and consumption moving in the same direction during the boom, or also in the moving workers around. And then now this is Krugman's second problem with Cochrane's view about workers needed to move out of the nail-pounding business in Nevada. So this is Krugman's objection to that view that, hey, the recession is necessary to move labor around to where it needs to be. This is what Krugman has to say. So the second problem is it doesn't explain why the recession reduces employment across the board, not just in industries that were bloated by a bubble. One striking fact, which I have already written about, is that the current slump is affecting some non-housing bubble states as or more severely as the epicenters of the bubble. Here's a convenient table from the BLS ranking states by the rise in unemployment over the past year. Unemployment is up everywhere, and while the centers of the bubble, Florida and California, are high in the rankings, so are Georgia, Alabama, and the Carolinas. All right, so to make sure you're getting his point here, he's saying if this theory is right, if the reason for the recession is this misallocation of resources story, then we should see the states that have the highest unemployment ought to be the states where the housing bubble was the most severe. But that's not what we see according to Krugman. He says, yeah, it's true, Florida and California, which who had real estate bubbles that were severe, also have high unemployment, but Georgia, Alabama, and the Carolinas have high unemployment, and they didn't have particularly bad housing bubbles. So clearly, Krugman thinks what's going on here is a general failure of aggregate demand. It's not this sector-specific misallocation of resources like the Austrians or Cochrane are talking about. All right, so don't tell anybody else, but I actually did some empirical analysis on this one, okay? So let's leave this room. So because just reading it, that sounded crazy to me. I mean, forget Austrian economics. I was like, you're telling me Krugman's saying there's really no connection between where the housing bubble was and unemployment? That seemed nuts to me. So I went and checked Krugman's numbers, and here's what he did. So he wasn't making up those figures. He linked to a BLS, Bureau of Labor Statistics, chart that showed year-over-year changes in the unemployment rate, meaning it was taking the unemployment rate at that moment in time and then comparing it to 12 months previously, and then ranking states that way to show which states over the previous year had seen the biggest deterioration in their employment situation. And so he looked at that ranking, and then he saw that, there's 3 states in the top 5, the Carolinas and Georgia and something else, that didn't have particularly bad housing bubbles. So he's like, see, this is stupid, this theory. Okay, but the problem is when Krugman wrote that, it was in December of 2008. So the year-over-year change in employment was from December 2007 to 2008. So if you just think it through, the housing bubble had burst well before December 2007. So if the Austrian story is right, and the housing bubble bursts, and then you start seeing, a breakdown in employment starting the epicenters, if you will, in those states that had the most severe housing bubbles, that was already in motion for over a year by the time Krugman starts looking at the start and end point of shifts in employment. Okay, so in other words, those states would have been in their mini recessions for 18 months already at the point when Krugman's going to start looking at the data. All right. So what I did is I said, let's do a fairer test, a tighter test of this relationship. And so I looked at the changes in unemployment and this unemployment's compiled monthly. So I went from June of 06 to December 08 to more accurately capture when was the peak of the housing bubble, and then the latest data point when we did this analysis, which was December of 2008. Instead of looking just here, I was looking at the start of the housing crash and what was then the current number to see the total change in unemployment in that period. And then I also ranked the states in terms of the biggest change in housing prices from the peak of the bubble to, when did I do it? To the same thing, to the same time period, okay? So if you do it that way, what do you find? Okay, so the top list there is the top 6 states in terms of the change in the point total of the unemployment rate, right? So if the unemployment rate went from 2% to 4%, that was a 2 percentage point change. Okay, that's the idea. So I'm looking at point changes. So those are the top 6, and then the bottom 6 list there is ranking the states by the most severe drop in the housing price index. And the closest, they did the housing things by quarter, so it wasn't a perfect overlap, but I did it as close as could be. Okay, so you see, of the 6 states in each list, 5 of them overlap. There's only one state in the top that's not in the bottom list, and there's only one state in the bottom list that's not in the top list. All right, so that is pretty significant. You try to say, okay, what are the chances this could happen randomly? In other words, what if the aggregate demand story is correct? It's still theoretically possible, just coincidence. 5 of the top 6 in both rankings could be the same. And when you want to figure that out, it's hard philosophically to specify, well, what is it that you're doing? Because the reason I picked 6 was because that's where the best fit was. In other words, the 7th states didn't match, so I left those out. You get what I'm saying? But I kept the 6th one in because the 6 states did match, because Michigan was in both. So I sort of did the best thing. So I said, well, it's not... If you just did this and said, what are the chances that 5 of the top 6 randomly are the same, that's like 1 in 350,000. But then you could say, but if it had been if it had been the same 4 of the top 5, I also would have said, ha, Krugman, I got you. And so I tried to allow for that. And so you could say, well, it'd be like 1 in 8,400 in terms of if I really broaden the category of what sort of result would have popped out at me to say, ha, Krugman, I got you. And that would have been easier, so I would say, still, that'd be like 1 in 8,400 would be the chances of this just happening randomly if it's Krugman's aggregate demand story. All right, so anyway, the point is simply that Krugman thought he had this knockdown argument, but he didn't really do a good test of what the thesis was. And he does that a lot, where he sets up his opponent, and then he does this quick casual look at the data and says, see? And you go and look and you say, well, no, wait a minute. If you actually want to test it, you would do it this way, and then actually the Austrian theory comes through with flying colors. Now, I never saw a retraction of this, and a lot of times people ask me, does Krugman read your stuff? I don't know. But I did notice that Brad DeLong used to favorably cite this. Brad DeLong would cite Krugman's article about how the states don't exhibit this pattern of the ones with the biggest housing bubble have the highest unemployment rate. So he used to cite that all the time, and then after my Mises Daily rant, when I made this point, DeLong stopped saying that. Like he would talk about that issue, and so he clearly would have brought it up, or it would have been natural for him to bring it up, but then he didn't. So I think, even though he didn't say, yeah, you got us, at least he realized, okay, we got to stop saying that, because that's a bad point. So anyway, there is hope. Okay, let's see, we got about 12 more minutes before I'll turn over your questions. Here is Krugman talking about, I think Mario Rizzo, is Joan here? No. I think Mario Rizzo at NYU was the one who found this, or maybe, no, I think actually Ebeling did, and then Rizzo picked it up. So anyway, there was this neat little thing in a newspaper from the 30s from 1932, where Keynes and a bunch of Keynesian economists wrote into the letter to the editors advocating for deficit spending, what we would know as of Keynesian policies. And Hayek and some other guys wrote in and were complaining about it and saying that, no, really what the problem is, and they were listing, Austrian critiques of what was going on. So Krugman sees that, and he says, 3 reactions. First, Hayek was as bad on the Depression as I thought. Krugman's always very sympathetic to his opponents. The claim that many of the troubles of the world at the present time are due to imprudent borrowing and spending on the part of the public authorities in 1932, ! Is bizarre. The claim that barriers to trade and capital movement were what was preventing recovery is as crazy as claiming that we're in a slump because workers decided to take a break in the face of prospective Obama tax hikes. All right, so there's a little inside baseball. He's referring to other debates. Don't need to worry about that. But the point I want to make here, and some of you were at my Great Depression lecture yesterday, Krugman, to him, it's just so obvious that the problem in the Great Depression was that the public or the authorities weren't spending enough. And so you notice here, this is the whole, you don't need to read the whole thing. My point is to say this was the entirety of Krugman's blog post. So the way he blows up Hayek is just to quote Hayek saying many of the troubles of the world in 1932 at the present time are due to imprudent borrowing and spending on the part of the public authorities. So in Krugman's mind, how do you defeat that argument? You just quote it and then put an exclamation point to say, what an idiot. So, and again, just in terms of, it just fascinates me that Krugman thinks that he's being real scientific and empirical when, suppose Hayek were right, suppose it really were the case that it was the reason the world economy was so bad, at least in part, was because the government's response to this crisis was not to just sit back and do nothing, but actually to spend record amounts and to do all sorts of public works projects. We talked about here yesterday, Herbert Hoover did all sorts of things, like the Hoover Dam, for example. That was a public works project that he got the ball rolling on and pushed through, and people were citing it. He had the Reconstruction Finance Corporation, which gave over $1 billion to banks that had lost a bunch of money in the collapse of the stock market and so forth, and real estate. So, Hoover did a New Deal light, and in my book, I document that, and I even quote people from the New Deal who even said after the fact, actually what we did was just an elaboration of what the Hoover administration had done. Right? So this isn't some wacky conspiracy theory I'm bringing. This is just, you look at the facts. In terms of spending, too, the Hoover administration ran record peacetime deficits. FDR actually campaigned against Hoover in 1932. FDR pledged to balance the budget, in contrast to this reckless spender Herbert Hoover. Okay, so the standard story we hear is nuts. But in Krugman's mind, it's just the very idea, this Hayek guy, he thinks that it was deficit spending, when again, suppose Hayek were right, just for the sake of argument, what would the world look like? Well, it would look like in previous panics or depressions with a small d, it was bad, the government sat back and did nothing, or actually would cut spending because their revenues were dropping and they thought, you got to have a balanced budget. And so they would actually cut spending, and it would be a sharp recession, and it would be over in a year or two. And that's what had always happened. Then in this one, for the first time in U.S. history, the American president decides, no, I'm going to roll up my sleeves and really fight this thing. And then it just gets worse and worse and worse years into it, when other recessions would have been over by that point. And so Hayek is saying that's part of the problem, is the governments around the world are doing these policies. And again, the way Krugman refutes that is with an exclamation point. Okay, the last argument I'll deal with here, because this one also is funny in the sense that anything in economics can be funny. All right, this is from John Quiggin, and I'll move this. He's an economist in Australia. I'll read the top half and then move it up, because I know in the back you can't see the bottom. Okay, so what Quiggin's doing, it's good, it's refreshing that he felt the need to go kick down the Austrian business cycle theory by name. All right, so again, that's progress on our part. We're finally being noticed. It's like the pretty girls in grade school, the other guys pull their hair and stuff. That's better than being ignored. I think that's if the girls might want to correct me on that. All right, so so Quiggin is talking about Rothbard, and the first of Quiggin's points that I don't have here is he says, all right, the major problem with this is that these Austrians blame everything on the Fed, but the Fed was founded in 1913 and we had business cycles before then. So then in fairness, or thankfully, Quiggin isn't a complete jerk. He tries to deal with what do the Austrians say to deal with that objection. So this is Quiggin talking. Rothbard gets around this fact by defining central banking to cover almost any kind of bank that has some sort of government endorsement, such as the Private Bank of England in the 19th century, and arguing for a system of free banking that would avoid, he asserts, these problems. Okay, so just make sure you're following here. So when someone brings that up, that objection to the Austrian, and I've heard that Tom Woods has fielded this objection, people say, wait a minute, you guys are blaming everything on the Fed, but we didn't have a Fed before 1913 and there were business cycles, so you guys are idiots. And then the explanation is, okay, you're right, it's technically not the Fed per se, it's government support of fractional reserve banking that's the issue, and the central bank is just the epitome of that institutionalization of that support. And you can even, I can't do this because I don't know the history well enough, but Tom can go through and tell you with each major depression with a small d and say what was going on in terms of banking history at that time. Like there might have been a war going on and so they inflated or whatever. Austrians can give you a specific explanation for why that particular boom-bust cycle happened. So Quiggin doesn't like that. He says, oh, come on. He's just going to expand the definition of what central banking is to cover anything. And so why is that a problem? Quiggin says, because on any plausible definition of the term, the U.S. had free banking from the Jackson administration to the Civil War, and that didn't stop the business cycle. So what Quiggin's referring to is Andrew Jackson famously killed the second bank of the United States. So that was, depending on how you rank it, the second or third central bank in the U.S. So Andrew Jackson gets rid of that, and then the Fed doesn't come along until 1913. So in that period, Quiggin's saying, come on, for all practical purposes, that's free banking, that's as good as you're going to get. So then he says, overall, the U.S. was much closer to free banking throughout the 19th century, in this period of alleged free banking, than in the period from 1945 until the development of the largely unregulated shadow banking system in the 1990s. But the business cycle was worse then, under the free banking period, or was worse then. And then he says in parentheses, how much worse is a matter of some controversy, but no serious economist claims it was better. Okay, so let me just make sure let me make sure you're getting that again. So he's saying, come on, Rothbard's trying to get around this problem by saying, oh, well, it was basically central banking in earlier periods of U.S. history, too. The government was at fault. But come on, Quiggin says, you clearly had from the Jackson administration up until 1913, that was free banking. And if you look at that period, there were more business cycles or more severe economic dislocations then than from the period of 1945 to the 1990s. So clearly, central banking is not what's at fault here, because you had depressions going on in this period of relatively free banking, and in this period, 1945 to 1990s, when there was a central bank, you didn't have a problem. So Rothbard, you're an idiot. Okay. Does everyone see what he did? This is funny. Again, what's he trying to do? He's trying to show Rothbard is wrong for thinking it's central banking that's basically at fault. And so Quiggins going to blow that up. He's going to look at, so you might say, okay, well, how would you test that? Okay, let's look and see the period when there wasn't a central bank. So from the Jackson administration in 1912, okay. And then you think you might compare that to the period when there is a central bank, from the period of 1913 to 2010. And you say, well, how does it stand up? Okay, well, from 1913 to 2010, we had the Great Depression, which was hands down the worst period in the world economic history, basically, except for maybe like the Black Plague or something. Okay. And you also had what we're just going through right now, which most people are saying is the worst thing since the Great Depression. So the two worst calamities in U.S. economic history happened on the watch of the Fed, which is clearly worse than what happened in this period of relatively free banking. So you'd think, we got you, Quiggin. No, because look what he did. He's comparing the period of free banking to the period from 1945 until the 1990s. So it's true. If you pick the period that rules out the two worst episodes in world economic history, then central banking's not too bad. That's great. All right. Okay, so I'm glad you guys thought that was amusing too. All right. Why don't I go ahead and stop there, and then I'll turn it over to your questions. Let me turn my alarm off. Yeah. Uh-huh.
He said that people with voluntary quit, that's why there is no unemployment in the beginning of employment.
Right.
You do not have to have unemployment because people take the job. Can you check the statistics? What about voluntary quits during booms? Do they rise?
Okay, so the question is, if my response, and I should probably clarify, when I say what's the Austrian response, I mean, what's my response? So in case I'm wrong, let's not hold on Mises with me. So his question is, if the response to Cowen and Krugman about why isn't there unemployment during the boom, with the response is because people are quitting their jobs and going into the boom sectors, have I checked the data to see, is it actually the case that voluntary quits go up during this period? No, I haven't checked the data. That would be a good thing to check. So you should do that. Or if some of you are budding econometricians, you should go check that. Yeah?
There was no central bank for tulip bulbs, but there was a tulip bulb bust. All Austrians are wrong. What do you say?
Well, it's lunchtime. So the question is, there was no central bank during the tulip mania, and yet there obviously was tulip mania, so what's the story? In all honesty, or seriousness, I don't want to speculate on that. Doug French is the guy to ask about that. I mean, he did a whole master's thesis, I think, on that issue. So I would talk to him. I don't know what the Austrian response is. Yep.
Like the consequences of the tulip mania will not become wide.
Okay. He's saying the tulip thing wasn't economy wide, which sounds right to me. But I'm not an expert on that. Yep.
Tyler Cohen in his book Risk and Business Cycles has 8 critiques, which one of them I would like to cite and you could comment on. He says the volatility associated with inflation might discourage rather than encourage long-term investments. And basically, that's one of his arguments why the Austrian Business Cycle theory is wrong.
Right. Okay, so to repeat the question, Tyler Cowen in his book has 8 separate objections to Austrian business cycle theory, one of which is, if I'm paraphrasing it wrong, let me know, is the idea that, look, the Austrians are trying to, their theory rests on the belief or the claim that credit expansion, the central bank pushing more reserves into the system, that's going to lead to more investment in longer-term projects that are unsustainable. But actually, surely the central bank doing that stuff causes more volatility, and other things equal, the more volatility there is, business people are going to clam up. They're going to be hesitant to invest in things. And so that seems to be a contradiction. Is that basically what he's arguing? Okay, so there, the one, I don't know if this is the response, but one thing that occurs to me is to say, well, hang on a second. given that there is this central bank that has this discretionary monetary policy, and entrepreneurs now can't plan as solidly or as confidently because they don't know what the purchasing power of money is going to be 10 years from now, the way they would under a gold standard society where there wasn't a central bank. In other words, people would be much more confident about what an ounce of gold would buy or a dollar would buy them 10 years in the future without central banking. Given that there is a central bank that can inject money at will and so forth, that's now a new fact of reality. So in terms of what's the correct market clearing thing to do with your business, that's now part of the institutional structure. And so it's still the case that if the Fed now lowers interest rates below what they would be given this new reality, that it's still on net causing business people to over-invest or to malinvest. That would be my response. Yep.
What's Krugman's beef with irrationality of markets?
Can you...
Fly in the face of Mises' action axiom necessarily constituting rationality.
Can you give me a specific, like, what did he say specifically? So Krugman's saying markets are irrational?
Yeah, like, how does he determine that? I don't know.
Okay, so the question is, Krugman seems to think markets are irrational, and doesn't that conflict with Mises' notion of action being rational? Is that fair? Okay. Well, you got to be careful. It's when Mises says that all action is necessarily rational, he means in the sense that by definition, action is distinct from just behavior. What action means is that some conscious being is using means to achieve an end. And so it's rational in the sense that it involves reason, but it could be wrong. Right? So it can be rational to go do a rain dance, and you could say, why are they doing that? Oh, because they want rain for their crops. They believe that performing these actions will, cause the gods to shower rain on the crops, and that's higher on their value scale than, having a drought, and so that's why they're doing it. So it's rational in that sense, but obviously it's not rational, or at least we don't think it is, in the sense of, technologically adequate to achieve the end. So if Krugman says markets are irrational, he doesn't mean it in that sense. He just means in the sense that you can't look at housing prices in 2006 and say, investors, took all available information into account, and therefore that's the best guide to future policy. So actually, I'm also a critic of what's called the rational expectations theory, or these efficient market hypothesis guys. I have a Mises Daily on Eugene Fama, and he had this interview. I won't take up too much time because I want to get to your questions here, but he had this interview with some magazine, I think, and Fama is the Chicago school guy who's like the godfather of the efficient markets hypothesis. And it almost read like a caricature of his position to me, but he was saying this stuff, and I don't know, again, if he's like bending over backwards to be extreme to get the point across, but he was denying that there was a housing bubble. He was saying, what do you mean by a bubble? I don't even know what that term means. He literally said, I don't even know what you mean by that term. Whatever just happened, that's a bubble, okay? That's what we mean. And he was saying, it had to be operational definition. It has to be predictable. If it's not predictable, then there wasn't a bubble. And the idea is, guys in this camp are going to say, it's impossible. You cannot identify a bubble in the midst of the bubble, because if everyone knows, like let's say a stock price, if everyone knows that stock is overpriced, and they know it's going to crash, next week, everyone's going to make sure they sell it 6 days from now. But if everybody knows that, they're going to sell it 5 days from now. So the thing's going to crash immediately. So the idea is you can never know that you're in the midst of a bubble, because that's impossible. And so there's various flaws in that argument. And one of the other flaws, too, is if you switch the analogy, and I actually got this from Matt Iglesias, who's not actually normally a fan of Austrians, but we both agreed that Fama was being an idiot in this article, is he was saying if you use the same logic that Fama was using to explain housing bubbles, you could say, let's say there's this town, and all of a sudden the ground starts shaking, buildings start collapsing, and thousands of people are dead. And afterwards, some seismologists come along and say, there was an earthquake here. And then a seismologist from the University of Chicago comes along. I'm making this up, so the joke is mine. I adapted Iglesias' point. And a seismologist from the University of Chicago comes up and looks around and says, well, no, people don't like being killed. If everyone thought there was an earthquake coming, they would have moved. So clearly, to be operational, have an operational definition, an earthquake needs to be predictable. So there was clearly no earthquake. And you might think like, come on, Bob, he wasn't being that stupid. Yes, he was. Go read his article. Okay, yeah.
Is there any free banking in the history?
So the question is, was there any period where even Austrians would say, yeah, that was free banking? Again, I'm not the historian on this one. I think like George Selgin and Larry White have written stuff on that, and they would be the people to consult. I mean, clearly there's periods where it's closer to what somebody like Rothbard would want than it is right now. But to my mind, no, I don't think there's any unblemished period where we could say that's exactly the sort of banking system we would want, that typically governments always were getting involved in suspending specie payments and things like that.
So it's just in theory, right? Is there any way to prove that free banking was
Sure. Right. So the question is, well, come on, if there's no period that meets your criteria of what a good banking system is, then is it just on faith? How do you know your system would work better if you can just rule out anything? But again, it's a matter of relatives, right? That it certainly is true that the U.S. economy was more stable when there wasn't a central bank than when there was, if you look at the whole period, not when you do Quiggins' trick of ruling out the Great Depression and the most recent crisis. So it's also true that every major crisis we can go look at and show, well, look at this is what the government did, and this is why more inflation happened than would have happened in a free market. Or, technically we don't know because we can't do the alternate universe where there was a free market, but we can look at specific government policies that encouraged the credit expansion and then suspended or mitigated the penalties to banks that engage in the credit expansion. So that's the sense in which, you could say this is what it would have been better. There would have been less volatility had there been a free market. Yep.
Professor Richard Evelyn told us the story that some business cycles that were created by the discovery of new gold mines in Australia. And also, for example, when Spain was in South America, invading South America, they moved a lot of gold from South America to Europe, and that created some other problems.
Okay, so the question is, or the issue is, even on the gold standard, when certain new mother lodes of gold were discovered and they got it back into the home country, could that have caused a business cycle, or did it cause a business cycle? Again, I'm not a historian, so I can't tell you, oh yes, in this period this happened, and then what this happened to the economy. I don't know that history well enough. In terms of the theory, I did recently do a Mises.org article on that issue. The question being, suppose you had a pure free market, and then someone finds a bunch of gold, and we're using gold as money, and so some guy discovers a bunch of gold, and what does he do with it? He just goes to the loan market and lends it out. So that would clearly push down the interest rate, and so the issue is, would that cause a boom-bust cycle? And according to a standard Rothbardian view. So in the article, I sort of chickened out. I didn't take a stand one way or the other. I just sort of gave, as a Rothbard, you could plausibly argue both ways. So let's very briefly recapitulate that. So on the side to say, yeah, it would be a business, it would cause a boom-bust cycle, you could say, look, even though it's obviously preferable to use gold as money than using paper currency, strictly speaking, as a medium of exchange, whether we have more gold or less gold, doesn't matter, right? The Mises' famous point about as a money, increasing the money stock doesn't make us wealthier. The way that you increase tractors or increase apples, we're richer per capita. If you double the money stock, even if it's something like gold or silver, in its capacity as a medium of exchange, we're not better off. It just means prices go up, right? So that we're not better off if there's twice as much gold if we're just using the gold in our pockets as money. So in that respect, then, it doesn't seem like there's a big economic difference between finding a bunch of gold and lending it out. Like, that hasn't increased the supply of actual capital goods, so shouldn't that cause a boom-bust cycle? Whether we do that or just the gold miners start practicing fractional reserve banking and print up extra tickets and lend them out. Either way, so we'll put it this way, if the problem with printing up tickets to gold that doesn't actually exist and handing it out, if the real problem economically is, the consumers out there haven't refrained from consumption and freed up real resources to fund these projects, that's what we would normally say. Well, how does me finding a bunch of gold sitting in the ground and moving it from the mountain into my vault and then printing up paper tickets and handing it out, people out there still haven't refrained from consumption. They might not even know that I found that gold. So how does the presence of a bunch of yellow metal in my vault change the fact that there is or is not going to be a business cycle, right? So that would be a way I could see a Rothbardian plausibly saying, doesn't really, that it's conceivable you could have a boom-bust cycle even with a pure gold money commodity. The other hand, the one that I'm sort of leaning towards is to say, well, just think about it. The saving, you say there's no one in the community that refrained from consumption, but yeah, there is. It's the gold miner, the guy who found that gold. I mean, his job, if you're a gold producer in a society where gold is the money, the people who own the land that happens to have gold in it, what's their job? What's their business? They pay workers to come dig up this yellow metal, and then their sales is they sell the gold. I mean, that's their revenue, right? It's kind of weird to us because the money is the thing they're producing, but that's what happens. And so that's income to them. That's how they pay for their house. That's how they go to dinner. So, normally if they find little bits of gold, that's clearly income. That's how they fund their lifestyle, and their contribution to the market economy is they're the ones who produce money. And if they happen to find a bunch of gold, and they say, okay, I could trade this and go get a Learjet and take a cruise or whatever, but no, I'm not going to do that. I'm going to save it and lend it out so that I get more income down the road. Well, if that's really income to them, well, then that's saving. They're refraining from potential consumption. So you could say, so it's not going to cause a business cycle because the lowering of the interest rate is legitimate. It's because somebody in the community saved more out of potential income. And you say, but where did the extra income come from? It's because this guy found a bunch of gold. That's where it came from. So anyway, like I say, it gets a little bit philosophical there, but that's the two tensions. All right, why don't we do one more question?
Okay, does the Mises Institute, and forgive me if I haven't been paying attention on YouTube or something like that, but does the Mises Institute...
Well, are you really sorry? Because I don't want to forgive you if you're not really sorry. Okay.
Do you guys actually host real debates and challenge people to answer some of these questions? Get it on video and stuff like that, or do they always refuse, or is it even part of the?
So the question is, do we actually formally invite people? Hey, do you want to come down to the Mises Institute and debate us, and we'll mud wrestle and have an arm wrestling competition, feats of strength and so forth. Or, do we just take pot shots from our blog and be like, haha, screw you? I think in practice probably the latter, but I kind of think, I don't know, Roderick, do you have any idea if we've ever actually...
I don't assume but we have a whole thing Robertson here.
Oh, yeah, right. Yeah, so it's certainly the Austrian Scholars Conference. Yeah, people do try to... There have been... So Paul Craig Roberts was very critical of the unfettered free trade position and thought, we libertarians were nuts and we're, killing the country. So he did come down to an Austrian Scholars Conference thing, and it was a debate format. I certainly would be willing to debate Krugman or whatever, and somebody asked him one time, they didn't name me, but they just said, hey, why don't you debate the Austrians sometime? And he literally said something to the effect of, because they're not serious, and I'm not going to waste my time doing that. So my guess is they wouldn't accept anyway, but I don't know if there have been official attempts to bring them down here. It'd be good because we could arrange for there to be an accident if they did come down. All right, thanks everyone.